Let's get started with this 15-mark question. Discuss the likely benefits of price discrimination on rail passengers. Use a diagram to support your answer. Price discrimination, of course, quite a popular topic for Edexcel. There's not really much they can assess on it, so the questions are extremely similar. A quite similar question came up in 2023. Specimen paper, very similar question. In 2023, it was just like this, 15-mark question. In the specimen paper, it was a 12-mark question. But essentially, benefits of price discrimination. And so some points for what is the main benefit of price discrimination? Of course, it leads to lower price for elastic demand consumers. I'm guessing there's going to be some sort of supporting in the extract. Okay, so here. So figure 3, price of single off-peak train journey Edinburgh to Leeds, Saturday. And yeah, so see, adult is £105 and a young person's is £70, so significantly cheaper. And of course, young people would be the elastic demand consumers, why of course they're much more responsive to changing price, they have a much lower income compared to adults, and adults in this scenario would be classed as more inelastic. Another cool thing to keep in mind is peak times. Of course, price discrimination of not even just adults versus children, of peak versus non-peak times, of course, still would be price discrimination. Okay, so moving on to the second benefit, it is quite a unique benefit. Let's actually start by it would be quite appropriate here to define price discrimination. Of course, it's when a firm charges different groups of consumers different prices for the same products. In this scenario, under 16s, over 16s, adults versus children are being charged different prices, and they're different groups, but for the same product. And now, what are some advantages of that? Of course, it means that compared to if they charge one price to all consumers. So for example, in this scenario, they're charging £69 to children and £105 to adults. Instead of that, if they charged one price, they might charge £80 to all consumers. The problem with that is that they'll lose out massively on the elastic demand consumers, and then also they lose out on inelastic. Why? Why would they lose out on inelastic? Since the inelastic consumers, they have a potential to charge them more, therefore they're missing out on how much they can charge them. And then on the other side of the spectrum, elastic, they may not be able to afford £80, therefore they may totally lose those consumers. So by firm price discriminating, so charging two separate prices, of course, what is the main aim? They get to profit maximize, and they get to, like I said, maximize their profits. But another advantage we usually say, and I think I mentioned it in the last time we did this exam paper video, is cross-subsidisation. So they can use this extra profits they gain from price discrimination. The example I gave last time was Royal Mail. So in built-up urban cities like Manchester, Leeds, London, Royal Mail, it doesn't cost them a lot to deliver parcels, since, for example, houses are very close. But places like the Scottish Highlands and just remote rural areas, it's quite expensive for them to deliver packages. But they use the money, the profits they gain from the relatively cheap deliveries in cities, and they use that to cross-subsidise the cost it is for like the rural areas, like we said, like the Scottish Highlands. And of course, cross-subsidisation, there's no clear example for railways, trains, but let's just think about something. So the simplest thing you think about is better service. So for example, what could improve the service? Like for example, being more on time, maybe better, like more comfortable seats. Like on like liner trains, of course, you get like food and drink, maybe cheap free food and drink, things like that. But yeah, overall better service, and they can use that, but they can fund that, they can finance that by cross-subsidising their price discrimination. Cross-subsidisation is quite a unique one in price discrimination, but gives you another one to speak about. And if price discrimination comes up in your exam paper, it's very likely for your paper 1 to be a 15-mark question. So 100% try to remember that, because it gives you so much more to speak about, and it's quite a unique point that you probably won't be able to come up with if you haven't revised it. But now let's move on to the diagram. And of course, the price discrimination diagram, we say there's 3 diagrams. Well, we use 3 diagrams to represent it. So let's get started with these price discrimination diagrams. So first things first, how do firms split their consumer base when they are price discriminating? Of course, they split their consumer base into elastic versus inelastic demand consumers, and that is the first thing, and that is the first thing to remember with price discrimination diagrams, and that makes it a lot easier to think about. And the third and the last diagram we draw is the total diagram. This is essentially saying if a firm was not price discriminating. So essentially, if a firm charged one price to all groups of consumers instead of price discriminating, which is of course charging different prices to different groups of consumers for the same product. But let's get started on how we actually draw these diagrams. For elastic, of course, we just started with a demand curve, and it just is just a normal elastic demand curve. There, that D equals AR. You can call that a shallow demand curve. Then inelastic, we draw a nice inelastic demand curve. You can call that steep, which is D equals AR. Then total, all you have to do do is join them together. So it says inelastic originally, and then when you get to enough quantity that it can make elastic, it juts out and becomes elastic. So it's basically inelastic for a bit, and then it finally becomes elastic. So that's all total, and that is D equals AR. And that is the first step in your price discrimination diagram. And of course, make sure to label your axes. It can be cost / revenue quantity. It can also be price / quantity. It doesn't really matter here. Just make sure they're labelled up, either one of them. Now, we've labelled these diagrams cost / revenue, but if we think back to our other cost / revenue diagrams, what other curves did they have? And let's just think about, for example, the classic cost / revenue diagram, which is a monopoly diagram. And of course, we're missing 3 curves here, which is the MC, the AC, and the MR. Let's get started with MR. What is the relationship between marginal revenue and the demand curve? Of course, if a few of you will remember, the relationship is, of course, that your MR is twice as steep as your demand curve, which is the exact same rule here. So let's get that labelled on. So it's twice as steep in all these diagrams. So something like that. And then for the last one, it's exactly the same. So it's twice as steep as the inelastic side, then it's twice as steep as the elastic side as well. So MR. Lastly, let's add our cost curves of MC and AC. And of course, if you can recall back to price discrimination, these are constants, so it's a straight line. So just make sure there's the same point on each of them. And that is pretty much your price discrimination diagram complete. Lastly, let's add our cost curves. And on price discrimination diagrams, if you can recall, it is just a straight line through them all. And this would of course be where MC equals A. Now, just as we would do on a normal cost / revenue diagram or a monopoly diagram, let's add on the point at which these firms profit maximize. And where is the profit maximization point? Of course, this is where MC equals MR. And where do we find these on these diagrams? So let's start with elastic. So MR is obviously the green line, MC is the blue line. So what we would do, we would go up from that point until we hit our AR curve. Now, what this tells us, this is of course the box of supernormal profit. That'll be Q max, that would be P max. Let's do the same for inelastic. So MC equals MR at that point. Then we keep going up until we hit our AR curve. So therefore give us this box of supernormal profit, Q max, and again P max. And then lastly, let's finish off with total. So MC equals MR at this point. We go up until we hit our AR curve. This would therefore give us P max again and Q max and the box of supernormal profit. Okay, so we've drawn the diagrams now. Let's use this to develop our chain of analysis, and this is why I'm always promoting depth of understanding and specifically to do with diagrams. So first things first, there's many things we can speak about here, but let's just keep it really simple. So one of the advantages we did not mention with price discrimination, we kind of mentioned it here, lower prices for elastic demand consumers. But specifically, one advantage we can usually say with price discrimination, in the example of, like, for example, Amazon, is that it can actually reduce inequality. And why is that? That's because there's lower prices for elastic demand consumers. Therefore, sometimes it can mean that that some consumers could afford products that they wouldn't be able to if there was no price discrimination, thus helping reduce inequality. What do I mean by that? Total shows if a firm was not price discriminating, if they were charging one price to all groups of consumers. And where do we see this? We see this by price P max. This is the price they charge to every single consumer, despite whether they're elastic or inelastic, as they're not splitting their consumer base. But let's contrast this now with elastic. So if a firm is price discriminating, they are charging their elastic versus the inelastic demand consumers 2 separate prices. Why does this help fight our case? As this now means elastic demand consumers are receiving much lower prices than if a firm was not price discriminating. Thus it means these individuals who have lower incomes could be able to afford some goods, could be able to afford these services that they could not before. Therefore, it can be a massive advantage of price discrimination that as elastic demand consumers are receiving lower prices, it can help reduce a level of inequality. They can now buy goods and services, they can demand goods and services that they couldn't before. And specifically relating this to the example of rail passengers, of course, in this scenario, the elastic demand consumers are, of course, young people, young adults, between 16 and 25, who are now paying £69.50 instead of paying a higher price if these firms are not price discriminating, where they might have charged around £80 for all consumers. So therefore, it can help, like I said, it helps these young people get around, and it helps these young rail passengers. And on the same theme, what else does this show? And a really appropriate thing that I usually do on these diagrams is label up the box of supernormal profit. Now, it might not always be fully representative, but what is the incentive for firms to price discriminate? Of course, the main reason that firms price discriminate is the main incentive for all firms. A classic economic assumption that firms are profit maximizers, and firms believe if they price discriminate, if they split their consumer base, they will end up making more profit. So the theory is that these boxes of A, B, and C is that A plus B is greater than C. Thus, it helps further that objective of a firm to profit maximize. Now, you can link these benefits together. So you can say, by a firm price discriminating, it helps further their profit objective. And if they're making more profit, of course, this allows these firms to have the potential to be more dynamically efficient, as you can spend more money into research and development, thus innovate and build better products, better quality products for the future. For example, higher speed rail, better quality food on services, etc, etc. And now you can link these benefits together. So we said A plus B is greater than C. If a firm price discriminates, they make more profit. And if they're making more profit, this means they can invest more into research and development. And they're investing more into research and development, they can develop more innovative, better quality products. For example, higher speed rail travel, better quality amenities on rail travel, for example. Therefore, basically, they are more dynamically efficient, thus better quality outcomes for consumers in the future. Okay, so we've gone through a lot of the advantages for price discrimination, but with regards to evaluation in this paragraph, the 6 marks you have with evaluation in your 50-mark question here, you would pretty much be saying the negatives of price discrimination, or just evaluating whether this firm can price discriminate. So now we've mentioned lots of positives here, but of course for this question, there are still 6 marks for evaluation. So in the evaluation, essentially all you would be doing is giving the negatives of price discrimination. First things first, of course, we talked about the increasing consumer surplus for elastic demand consumers, but on the flip side of things, we have inelastic demand consumers who are receiving worse, who consumer surplus is becoming smaller. Why? Of course, since when firms price discriminate, inelastic demand consumers are charged higher prices. And for example, if you relate back to context, they are now charged £105. Thus, of course, you could evaluate saying, however, in evaluation, this depends on the loss in consumer surplus, as for example, inelastic demand consumers will be suffering a massive loss in consumer surplus due to being charged higher prices. And of course, another massive thing we mentioned is that price discrimination is going to help maximise these firms' profits. It's going to help further the objective of firms to profit maximise. But then again, if you look back to the extract where it talks about Virgin Rail, the reason why they had to be rescued by the government and had to be shut down is that their revenue was low, so of course their profits were low. So it could show that price discrimination is not a solution to the problems for these rail firms, as there's bigger problems. Now, another great evaluation point, which is specifically more relevant to the internet, is how firms class their groups of consumers. So how they class their elastic versus their inelastic demand consumers. As for example, price discrimination can become a massive negative if consumers are classed in the wrong class. As for example, if an elastic demand consumer is incorrectly classed as inelastic, this means they will be charged a massively higher price than they should be charged, thus meaning a massive loss in consumer surplus, and meaning that they probably won't be able to afford a good that they should have. So the way I would word that point is saying, however, in evaluation, the effectiveness of price discrimination depends on whether a firm accurately groups its consumers. And a great example of this is Amazon. Amazon use things like your IP address, just all the data they have on you to try and class whether you are an elastic or inelastic demand consumer. Thus, for the same products, they charge different groups of consumers different prices. And because it's online, everything is very variable, everything is very dynamic, they do it very well. And it's some great real world application. Amazon uses things like stock levels, things like even the time of day, and factors like whether you are a customer who's likely to purchase straight away, or you're likely to add something to your basket and then not really purchase it. So they use all this data they have and they amend the price they charge accordingly. Moving on, another bit of advice I always give with regards to evaluation is question the assumptions. Now, if you know your content knowledge well, and especially if you know the details of price discrimination mentioned on the You Do Econ website, but one of the main assumptions we make is that firms have a degree of monopoly power. So they are able to set prices and consumers will still buy. So they have enough market power where if they increase prices, consumers have a degree of inelastic demand where they still have to continue to buy from these from this producer. But now, a great evaluation to that assumption is talking about, of course, the level of regulation within the market. As yes, these firms will have a degree of monopoly power, but it really depends on the degree of regulation as to how much they're able to use this monopoly power. As for example, we see that this firm was able to charge consumers £105, the adults, £105.30 to inelastic demand consumers. But how much could they rise this price that they're charging inelastic demand consumers before a regulatory authority, the Office for Road and Rail, which is the ORR, would step in and stop, for example, Liner, charging these groups of consumers too high prices and exploiting these consumers. And of course, you could also mention the CMA just generally would step in and stop a firm like Liner exploiting consumers with higher prices. And I probably wouldn't mention this point in my evaluation as it's a bit weak, but it's just another idea to give you guys, as it might be relevant in a question you answer in the future. But another assumption we make in price discrimination is that firms are able to limit reselling. And what we mean by that is, for example, adults cannot buy a child's ticket and get away with it. As for example, on trains, of course, you know that your ticket gets checked, and if you have a child's ticket, being an adult, you will have to purchase another ticket as you're not valid for that ticket. But you could, of course, in an evaluation point mention, as when they increase the price for adults tickets, as you can see the discrepancy between the adults versus young persons tickets, it increases the incentive for individuals to either just buy a child's ticket or just to not buy a ticket, so illegally get onto these trains. Therefore, you could talk about how price discrimination actually will lead to worse outcomes in terms of revenue, in terms of profits, rather than better outcomes. But yeah, that is how I tackle this 50-mark question. As I said, we have gone through this diagram previously in detail. I just wanted to do a quick recap on this diagram with a few advantages and a few disadvantages. But yeah, try to use the extract as much as possible. This is a bit of a tricky extract. There's not really much in the extract here, but try to drag out as much as possible. But yeah, that's how it answers that 50-mark question. And that is the end of this section B for 2020 Pitbull.